Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Al Tillery, the director of the Center for the Study of Diversity and Democracy. I want to welcome you to the April installment of the Anti-Racism in Thought and Action lecture series. Today's topic will be Lessons from the Field, a real conversation about racial equity work in cultural institutions. It's a pleasure for me to introduce my colleagues, Stephen Adams and Stephanie Hicks, from the Change Makers Committee, who have been working with me to program this great series. I'm going to turn it over to them so they can introduce our speakers and start this great program. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you for the introduction, Al. And I have the honor of introducing these two forces that we have with us today. And I'm going to start with Makeba Clay, who is the Horning Chair of Diversity, Equity, and Access and Inclusion for the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C. Clay is a transformational global leader with a distinguished 20-plus year career in federal and local governments, nonprofits, and educational institutions. She received accolades from notable international organizations, and she has been featured in national publications, including most recently the Washington Post, for her esteemed diversity and inclusion efforts in the arts and culture industry. She is the first ever endowed Chief Diversity Officer of an arts museum in the United States. I think that deserves its own round of applause. As an organizational leadership and transformation strategist, Clay is notably sought after for her professional success in executive group facilitation, consensus building, training, and keynote speaking. She is the CEO of Innovative Global Solutions Consulting, LLC, or Makeba Clay Consulting, a boutique firm that helps organizations drive fundamental change through the strategic alignment of people, processes, and technology. Ms. Clay is the former national president of the Association of Black Women in Higher Education, and she currently maintains the following board leadership and professional affiliations. So the U.S. Women's Chamber of Commerce, Girls on the Run, Women Business Owners of Montgomery County, the Maryland Black Chamber of Commerce, the Society for Human Resources Management, Hustling International, the National Speakers Association, the Maryland Humanities for the Arts, Museum Hue, the DC Commission on Arts and Humanities, and the Art Table for DC. Arts Administrators of Colors, and then the American Alliance of Museums. Clay holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University at Albany, and a Master's of Arts degree from Bowling Green State University. She holds professional certificates in diversity management and equal employment opportunity, compliance and investigations from the School of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell University. She is a qualified administrator of the Intercultural Development Inventory and the DISC Inventory. Makeba is a certified mediator, a chaplain, and the founding director of both the Diversity Institute of Charles County and the Community Mediation Center of Charles County. Ms. Clay has lived, worked, and traveled to nearly 60 countries, and she enjoys mentoring young girls and women, culinary arts, interior design, event planning, and reading on a wide range of topics. She resides in Montgomery County, Maryland, with her spouse and daughter. Thank you so much, Makeba, for being here. We are so excited to hear you speak. Also with us, the illustrious Calinda Lee, who is the head of programs and exhibitions at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. Educated at Spelman College, she received a Bachelor's of Arts and a Master of Arts from New York University and Emory University. She received a Master of Arts and a PhD. Calinda Lee joined the center to head up their substantive program work on education, civic engagement, facilitated conversations, and training experiences for diversity, equity, and inclusion, law force, and advocacy. In her particular role, Calinda's historical expertise informs opportunities to connect stories and events from the past with current day circumstances. The value of community engagement and historical interpretation, as well as civil and human rights work, is of the utmost importance to Calinda and informs programs and initiatives under her leadership. Calinda previously served as the Vice President of Historical Interpretation and Community Engagement for the Atlanta History Center. In that role, she served as Chief Historian, considering historical interpretation for all aspects of the region's past to develop the AHC's primary collections, historic houses, historic gardens, and public programs. Calinda also developed community engagements and the AHC's neighborhood initiatives. As a scholar and administrator, Dr. Lee has held teaching and administrative positions at Emory University, Loyola University, Chicago, and Spelman College. A prolific practitioner, she is an award-winning curator, writer, and educator. In addition to the center and AHC, she has worked with institutions including the Albuquerque Museum, the City Museum of Washington, D.C., the Maryland Museum for African American Life and History, and the Chicago History Museum, Emory University, among so many others. Our crowd is virtually welcoming you both, and we are so excited to have you with us. And without further ado,
first of all, I want to thank the Changemakers Review Committee and the Center for the Study of Diversity and Democracy for hosting this important conversation and for inviting me to participate. Steve and Stephanie, thank you for your gracious introductions. I'm looking forward to sharing some thoughts, a few brief thoughts, and being in discussion with my good colleague, Makeba. I have been working in cultural institutions for 25 years now. As an academically trained scholar who spent some of that time as faculty, I've thought a lot about the ways that scholarly work in public humanities intersect in terms of content. I've also spent quite a lot of time considering the ways that institutional dynamics in both contexts that make claims on valuing equity and facilitating societal transformation, often actually reflect the values that conserve and replicate systems of inequality. And so what to do about that? Usually, when we begin conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion, cultural and academic, quite frankly, institutions focus on content. Content-forward work ensures that the subjects we are exploring are more inclusive. In cultural institutions, this usually means that there's a push beyond white-centered narratives and artistic representations. It usually looks like a push to respect the idea that, quote, everyone has a story to tell, and we should allocate resources to sharing those stories and perspectives. I've served in a variety of roles that focused on content, developing scholarship and interpretation via exhibitions, programs, K through 12 curricula, higher ed curricula, and community partnerships. Some of the language that institutions use to discuss this work include things like difficult dialogues or creating brave spaces, creating opportunity for equal dignity. Within the context of those efforts, we're very much often looking at specific installations, exhibition and curatorial work, or programs. Some of the examples of work that I've done in that vein is represented in the images that you're seeing. So you're looking at some images from an oral history I conducted with the late Congressman John Lewis, and a program considering the history of enslavement on the landscape that my institution was occupying in both of these images. In cultural institutions, increasingly, these investigations of the past explicitly consider contemporary implications as well. So we are in this effort to connect the past with the present, understand the past as context for the present. And very often embedded in that is a call to action of some sort for visitors/participants. But if a space is truly inclusive, content focus is not sufficient. Representation is great, dialogue is fantastic, but there's more that's necessary. Institution-focused efforts demand much more than simply adding content. In roles as vice president, division head, association council member, managing director, board director, et cetera, I've been a part of an effort to insist that inclusivity in cultural institutions means, quote, everyone has a seat at the table and there is true equity of opportunity within the institution. That changes power structures, demands that opportunity hoarding be addressed, consider strategic directions, and allocation of institutional resources to support those goals, and et cetera, and et cetera. The image that I'm showing you actually, the images that I'm showing you kind of represent some of those efforts. And so I want to unpack them a little bit so that I can more fully explain what I mean. And the two stacked images that are on the left of my screen, what you're seeing are community involved efforts to curate a history that is meaningful, not only in terms of the scholarship around the past, but also about contemporary implications. How might communities decide what aspects of their history and culture are important to represent, and how does that interact with their goals towards equity in a current context? In the image on the right, or of my screen anyway, that stands over the text, you see two muralists standing in front of their work. Hopefully I'll get a chance to talk with you a little bit more about this during the Q&A, but I thought it was an interesting thing to share because I stepped into a space as a professional in this instance in my work with communities, being really clear about a story that I thought we could tell that would be meaningful to that community. And one of the things that our community stakeholders ended up saying to me was that while the story was quite interesting, and it happened to do with immigration, and it had to do with a dramatic rendering of a story that had to do with a traffic stop and the trauma that was caused by that stop. The people in that community said, we know this story. These are narratives that are meant to develop more content understanding and empathy for other people about our story, but they're not useful in producing equity for us. They're not the story that we want to share with members of our community so that we can be more greatly empowered. And they ended up asking for what you see kind of behind these muralists instead. And I think that was a really important learning opportunity about thinking in really careful ways about what we're creating and who we're creating it for, and whether we are only content forward or whether we're really inclusivity seeking in terms of changing the structure of institutions. Finally, I want to give you a few things to consider as we determine whether you might need to engage DEI work in your institutions, in your divisions, in your departments, in your fill in the blank. Is this a welcome all experience? And is that experience matching the rhetoric of your institution, of your department, of your discipline? Is your messaging to visitors, students, et cetera, but within the cultural sector, it's definitely about visitors, matching your messaging to staff? This is often a source of tremendous tension. Do we all understand the institution's posture on inclusion, or even get the language of diversity and inclusion at all? And what's the vibe? How do things really feel? Very often we engage these exercises that are rhetorical in their iteration and in their, obviously in their articulation, but in their iteration, and also really rhetorical in terms of what they ultimately produce. But do they produce change that people feel at every level within the institution? And lastly, are you having incidents and or pain points? And if so, are you successfully resolving them? So that's DEI training. That often has to do with creating content that is meaningful to a broad variety of audiences, creating representation, making space for scholarship, artistic production, exhibition, programming. But what about if you need a DEAI cultural shift? Guess how you determine whether you need a DEI cultural shift? The factors are exactly the same. But we must also consider this. What access to privilege, that is unearned power and access to power, is the organization and individuals empowered within the organization willing to give up? Because that is an essential aspect of true cultural shift that ultimately is absolutely necessary to create true equity within the organization. So what's the appetite for equity, wherever it is that you're standing? Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you to those of you who are part of the Changemakers Program Committee. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today with you and Calinda, my co-panelist, for this very important conversation. As it was mentioned, I am at the Phillips Collection as the inaugural Chief Diversity Officer. Most recently became an endowed chair of a program by way of a generous contribution from one of our board members and her family foundation. Very excited to be here. That was one of the goals that I had set out for the institution, to sustain this work. Too often the work around diversity, equity, access, and inclusion is seen as a program, an initiative effort. But as Calinda so rightly mentioned, this work needs to be positioned as systems work and work that is sustained and ongoing and belongs to everyone in the organization. I'm starting with a print here, Norman Rockwell, an iconic print that most folks are probably familiar with, the problem we all live with. It's in our collection, but because it's part of my story. I grew up in upstate New York in an all-white middle-class community. As my daughter said, my 9-year-old, my mom was just like Ruby Bridges. She was fighting racism and she had to be courageous. Well, not just like Ruby Bridges, but I did in fact come by this work by way of that experience, living in that neighborhood, being in the classroom, feeling marginalized and excluded, and in fact feeling racism nearly every day. That was, of course, softened by the lessons that I learned at home, which was around how to be a person who is not a bystander, but someone who is an upstander, as we're calling it now, standing up for change, whether it be for myself, for others, standing up for greater inclusion and greater equity. Those lessons, I think for me, I know for a fact is what catapulted me into this career of diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. I want to tell you a little bit about the Phillips Collection, just because some of you may not have had an opportunity to visit the collection. We wanted to share a little bit of a case study. So the Phillips Collection is America's first modern contemporary art museum. It was founded in 1921 in DuPont Circle, Washington, D.C. It was founded by the collector and philanthropist, Duncan Phillips. Most folks know the Phillips by way of Renoir, Degas, Matisse, Picasso. Those are the most famous early works that Phillips and his family collected. Interestingly, it's a story of privilege, of course. What you're looking at in this image is Duncan Phillips and Marjorie Phillips, his wife. The house, this is the home that they owned. On the left to the right is the annex of the museum. So their collection had started with Duncan Phillips' parents giving him and his brother $10,000 annually to collect art. And soon after, during 1918 is when this gallery was begun in this home. It later became a museum in 1921. Coincidentally, it was due to tragedy that Duncan Phillips started collecting art. It was the loss of his father due to heart failure, and 14 months later, his brother due to the Spanish influenza epidemic in 1918. When he started to collect art, one of the things he was quoted saying is that sorrow all but overwhelmed me. Then I turned to my love of painting for the will to live. The reason why I'm sharing that is because it has resonance even now in thinking about how art is being used for healing and thinking about the great loss 100 years later. We began it in an epidemic. We are now celebrating our 100th anniversary in an epidemic as well. These are some of the paintings that I mentioned early on. Folks come from thousands of miles to see the boating party, which is on the left. If you were to see more closely this image, you would see perhaps what looks like a casual affair of privilege and frolicking during lunch with an all-white audience, mostly men in that image. I'm not an art historian, so I'm sure Calinda would correct me on some points here. We have now in our new collection for this exhibition, what I love is the fact that we have some new acquisitions in our collection over the last 4 years actually. Seeing Differently is what you're looking at now, the current exhibition. And Seeing Differently, the Phillips Collects for a New Century is really what this work around diversity, equity, access, and inclusion is about. It's what I feel like I've been doing for 20 plus years, getting people to see differently, to shift perspective, to go beyond what they think they know about issues of race, racism, equity, inclusion, et cetera. And so I was just, as we were planning for this exhibition, for this 100th anniversary, these are G's Ben quilts on the left that you're looking at, Benny Andrews' Trail of Tears, upper right. Getting people to come outside of themselves and think differently about what they see. And then of course, we know our work is around changing hearts and minds, but then getting to some behavioral change that goes into policy change, et cetera. In our collection, one of the things that folks most know about on the far right, when you think about early collection of artists of color, Jacob Lawrence, the Migration series to the upper right hand. It's a cornerstone of our collection. In 1942, Duncan Phillips did purchase 30 of the odd number panels. The other 30 are at MoMA in New York. Which depicts the mass migration of African Americans from the rural South to urban areas. It's just the first wave of that migration, the 1916 to 1940. One of the things that we are doing and have been doing is using this work, Jacob Lawrence, as well as other elements of our collection for our K through 12 programming, teacher education, infusing that into our partnerships, both online medium as well as in classroom with teachers. On the bottom, this is an image of, some of you may be familiar with this artist, Janet Taylor Pickett, who is, excuse me, since the early 90s has been an artist. One of the things about our collection is that we have been known to put our work in dialogue, taking pieces from our collection from the 19th century, putting it in dialogue with our permanent collection and then contemporary artists. So this is an example of that, where Janet Pickett Taylor has taken her work on the left, and she's was inspired by the work of Henry Matisse, which is this object on the right-hand side, Matisse's Interior with an Egyptian Curtain, 1948. Every room in our gallery attempts to be in conversation with the other pieces that are typically looking at issues around race, gender identity, national identity, lots of issues, social issues. Art is a way into many of the complex conversations that we have in our public programs. These are just some examples of public programs. We have a robust music program as well. Interns work with critically fragile individuals in our school system, as well as a creative aging program where folks with dementia and who may be different levels of ability on the top right come in with caregivers and create work, create artwork. this is a image here of our internship program. So when we think about equity and access, we know that the field of museums is largely white, very privileged. Folks who were able to get into the field typically have had internships, 2 or 3 or 4 at prestigious institutions that they've taken literally at a cost to them. If they are from a first generation family, or if they've just didn't have money, they had to make a sacrifice. Folks who, you know, are in the field who were privileged enough to that didn't matter. They were able to have funds from their family to take forth. So the main reason for having this program, is for creating a pathway and a pipeline into the field for students, in particular, first generation, and those who may not have otherwise access. The bottom left, and I'm almost done before we go into our Q&A, I had an opportunity the first year into my work at the Phillips to take a journey to Dharamsala, India. Had a chance to be in a private audience with His Holiness Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama. And one of the things that we were talking about, which relates to the work at the Phillips, is using art as healing, but also using art as a way to create empathy and action around complex global issues. There were museum professionals, myself included, as well as others from different fields. But one of the quotes that I jotted down from the Dalai Lama: "Intolerance leads to hatred and division. Our children should grow up with the idea that dialogue, not violence, is the best and most practical way to solve conflicts. The young generations have a great responsibility to ensure that the world becomes a more peaceful place for all. But this can become reality. But this can only become reality if we educate not just the brain, but also the heart." This goes back to what I was talking about changing minds and hearts. "The educational systems of the future should place greater emphasis on strengthening human beings, human abilities such as warm-heartedness, a sense of oneness, humanity, love, and empathy is based on our coexistence." So we use art because it allows us to see one another, to see differently what we weren't able to see before. I'll leave with a case study that'll take us into our conversation. When we ask the question, are arts institutions ready for this journey that they have signed up for and all jumped on and said, we want to center equity, we want to have an anti-racist lens for our work. And we must, because our public is demanding that of us. We had a recent case study. What you're looking at here is a piece by Arthur Dove called "Going Fishing." At least that's what it's called now. Our founder, Duncan Phillips, collected this object back in, it was created in 1925, and we bought it in 1937. It's an assemblage piece. And it was previously titled "Nigger Goes A-Fishin'." Nigger Goes A-Fishin'. This is a piece that was then later changed before the creator, the artist, passed away. He changed the name to "Gone Fishing." Well, what's interesting about this, and what's also problematic about it, is that this piece has been in our collection since this time. I mentioned to you 1937. Never have we before spoken about the original name of this piece, which is about an African-American man who was fishing in Long Island. That is what was the inspiration from this artist. We've never talked about the racist title. We never talked about the fact that it's in our collection. Our public, only until recently, is aware that this piece was named in this racist manner. Why does this matter? Because as we set forward last year to explore and examine our institutional history, people, I think most of the folks around the table who signed up and said, yes, that's a brilliant idea, did so thinking that we would be looking at the nostalgic aspect of our work, our founder, looking at his bio, revising some text perhaps on our wall text and on our website, but they didn't know that seeing differently means this, what we're talking about today, bringing on a new lens to revise history in this way and really interrogate more deeply what it is we thought we knew about our collection. This is what the public is asking us to do, and it's our responsibility. So Steve, I'm
thank
done.
you. Thank you for Makeba, and we sort of use that last piece as a springboard into our conversation. Controversial collections abound in libraries, archives, and museums. Your story reminds me of the ongoing debates about repatriation of artifacts from the colonial period and the recent lawsuit alleging that Harvard University illegally profited from images of enslaved people. You may have seen the story floating around. How do you go about helping? And this is really to both of you, if you do this work. But we'll start off with Makeba. You know, how do you go about helping your institution decide a way forward in these fraught conversations?
This work requires courage. This work requires transparency. And it also requires us to think back to our mission and what our responsibility is to our public. And for me, I'm able to do that by, well, one, we just went through a new strategic planning process that I was a part of, to go back to our 5 pillars. And in that, those 5 pillars is language that is so deeply focused on DEAI almost every step of the way. And so one, I think people need to be able to see it as our strategic priority. It's not a peripheral thing. It really is, in fact, what it is we say we're supposed to do and who we say we are as an institution, what our, it aligns with our values. I think on the ground daily, just like that case study that I shared, I'm going to tell you, it was not easy. I literally was in virtual meetings where I saw people clutching their pearls when I said, this work is not about tweaking and editing. This is not an editing exercise. This is going deep and wide across the institution. And our collection, we need to lean into that. Collections are the most treasured gems of these institutions. People want to know, from where did those collections come? What do your ledgers look like? Your financial record? Ooh, wait till we get into that, So these are the things that I just remind people of. And there are some times when I have to say a prayer or two before those meetings, because I know it's going to get a little prickly. So.
Yeah, no doubt, or a lot prickly. I have a couple of answers with regards to that question. One, I think is about stepping back and really remembering, and sometimes that means redefining, to whom you are accountable as an institution. Mm-hmm. So, at the very base of things, part of the sad reality, especially among many of our legacy institutions, is that when we see them being inequitable, or when we see evidence, for example, of racism, particularly in moments past, there is a tendency to think about those institutions as failing, as not working. One of the things as an historian that I always point out is that actually those institutions are working exactly as they were designed to work. They were designed to protect and to replicate the systems of power that are representative of that institution and the most vaunted institutions, of that culture and the most vaunted institutions of that culture. And so what you're really being accountable to doing is redefining to whom you're accountable. When you say the people, when you say what sorts of history matter, or what sorts of art matters, or what stories must you tell with it, you're raising a new issue around who you're accountable to. And I'll give you a very specific example. And it's an example that's a little bit of notoriety to me, because it's, I ended up fussing in the Washington Post about this myself. I worked for an institution for a period of time that acquired a painting called the Cyclorama. And that painting was a rendering of the Civil War that in the round, so some of you all might, it was the Battle of Atlanta, Cyclorama. So if you're familiar with cycloramas, this notion of these enormous paintings in the round. And when I say enormous, I mean they take up whole large rooms, whole theater spaces. And this painting depicted the South winning the Civil War. It also depicted the Civil War as, or I should say depicts, it still exists, right? It also depicts the Civil War in a manner that reifies the kind of trope of the lost cause, right? So, there are these valorous Southern Confederate soldiers on horseback kind of chasing away the evil Yankees, none of whom are Black. Black people apparently had nothing whatsoever to do with their own emancipation. There are no women of any sort, like there's no color, there's no women, there's this, there's this particular narrative. It is Gone with the Wind, writ large in paint. And it was, it remains, it not only was, but it remains a significant piece of art. And it was a piece of art that Georgia school children had to interact with as part of their standards in 5th and 8th grade. So almost every school child within 100 miles of Atlanta at one point in time had to, for generations, had to visit this and understand it as history. My institution acquired it and was excited to spend millions of dollars to restore this piece of art. And the question became, how is it going to be interpreted? And my insistence was, we have to speak to its silences. We have an obligation to talk about not only what is rendered, but what is intentionally not rendered.
Yes.
And what that means, not only then, but subsequent to that moment, in terms of power on this landscape and a fundamental sense of who mattered and who didn't matter, and in a way of really, miseducating people for many, many generations about those realities. So, in very many ways, this kind of work doesn't only impact the institutions with which we work directly, but really has a much broader context in terms of the impact that those institutions have on our society and the way that they create over time a sort of kind of a priori knowledge base that's really sometimes a miseducation.
Thank you, Calinda. And this question maybe will give you a chance to say a little bit more about that. As cultural institutions deepen their focus on DEAI, some might experience individual or institutional reluctance to self-educate and resistance to embed racial equity in the institution. How do we overcome these barriers? What are some of the opportunities that can be leveraged to advance this work? This is, I guess, Calinda, you can start if you have something, or we can pass to Makeba, either way.
I would say a couple of things. I think, this is a real fundamental interrogation of your values. Rhetorically, cultural institutions claim to be institutions that are cultural critics, right? And that are equity seeking and that give voice to alternative ways of framing what is best for society and what has mattered in society. But when you really get right down to it, it is not only a process of, as I was saying in my original PowerPoint, like including additional content, right? It is also ultimately a process of changing systems, as Makeba so well articulated. And changing systems does not just mean that you're adding people and perspectives to voices and spaces of power, it also means that people who have disproportionate access to power have to give something up. And I think that that is really the critical concern, right? People can be well-intentioned, but be opportunity hoarding, hiring their friends, thinking about, how you engage within the community of professionals that you already know, valuing certain sorts of expertise over other sorts of expertise, particularly in an art context. We see this all the time. It's so funny, Makeba, you were showing us an image from the Benny Andrews collection. I just had a conversation last week with the hometown museum of Benny Andrews and their desire to curate an exhibition of his work, and struggles over whether to dedicate a whole space in that building to his family because of the imperative of giving that family an actual say in perpetuity about what goes in there and giving context to the work that he presented and saying something about that community, Madison, Georgia, right now. And so, that's, I'm going to let Makeba jump in now, but I think that, really, really assessing your appetite, being willing to give something up and being willing to allocate then appropriate resources to equally empower and creating positions of peership is really important.
And I think to your point, Calinda, one of the things that museums, the cultural institutions are being faced with is that engagement with the community, not just serving up programs and putting them out in the community. Here's what we have for you, but really bringing in their voice, their perspective. And, it's not, you can't just call in an advisory committee or an advisory board and say, okay, we've done our part. How then are you actually implementing and bringing in their lens to help shape and craft a new whatever, if it's exhibitions, if it's a new, for us, board advisory around inclusion, greater inclusion on our board. And I think that is about the power sharing dynamic that you talked about. Also, one of the things that when you talk about like, what are people fearful of? I think it's fear of giving up the power. It's fear of these conversations that people are not equipped for. A year ago, I wasn't in meetings where, I don't know about you, but I wasn't in meetings where people were saying white supremacy and power. People have a whole new lexicon now, right? Whether they know what it means or not. They were saying DEA, what is it? The alphabet soup. They're showing up, anti-racism, they really want to, whether they know all of what that means, especially our early and mid-career folks who are millennials, and they're coming in expecting something different and calling us on the carpet and saying, we have to unbury white supremacy in these institutions with our collection, with our other policies, etc. The board dynamics have also shifted. They're not there yet, because I think in the staff ranks, it's slightly different. Those folks who've been doing the community engagement, it's a different dynamic. A lot of my work is now centered on board governance. These are folks who, that's another workshop, perhaps another session. But anyway, it's a real, I mean, I have some partners in that, Raym, I will say. I have some partners on our board who have, one, funded this work to say, I really believe in this work and want to invest in it. Two, been at the Phillips, as an example, we've gone from, in terms of representation, it's not enough, but it does matter when you have a white board. I think we have one board member of color, Black man on our board, and he passed away. Now we have 4 board members, Black, 1 Asian board member. My question now is, are they in leadership? What kind of decisions are they making? Listening to folks. Even on boards, there's, even among white folks, new money and old money, whose voice gets heard. So inclusion, it's all these different layers that we have to pull back and ask questions about. We were not used to asking these types of questions until I showed up on the scene in this role. And I think this is why these types of roles are critical.
Absolutely. One of the things that I'm hearing a lot of resistance to just the proliferation of letters that institutions are writing. Many are calling these letters performative diversity, equity, access and inclusion measures. How do we get away from that performativity and sort of move to a better place? And I guess that probably has to be our last question, because we're running low on time. You two have really and truly sparked my curiosity today, but let's talk a little bit about performativity.
Steve, what you don't measure doesn't get done, right? And so that's something that I'm very clear about. People have to not just do the checklist, here are the 5 things. How are you measuring that? Are you holding your institution accountable, those in leadership, and frankly, those across the board? And that's one of the things that I've encountered the most resistance, or a lot of resistance, not the most, but a lot of resistance around not just saying you're doing the work, but actually having consequences when the work is not being done, when you are not, as a leader, advancing this work. Then are we to do in that instance?
Yeah. And I would also say that, what you don't measure doesn't get done, and what you don't fund doesn't get done.
Yes,
and so when I talk about giving something up, right, we know that we all work within institutions that allocate resources to the things that matter to them the most. And so there is a very real question about what that means and how those priorities are arranged and what kind of gets shunted aside and what there is in fact resources for, whether those are lines in terms of human resources or accountability measures that are actually implemented, or projects and initiatives that live beyond a moment in time that looks like some sort of pain point or flashpoint. Those are true indications, I think, of what it means to move beyond performative or virtue signaling, and into true true equity building. The other thing I would say about that, just really quickly, is I think that we talk a lot about unburying white supremacy as well. We must, uncover a thing to confront it. But I want to also talk about the ways in which white supremacy takes up all the space in the room, right? And the conversations around that. And there is something else, there is something more. Again, Makeba, there are all these points of intersection between us. And I always like to give people credit for their own brilliance. And so I'm going to quote someone that we both know. We were talking about, I was talking to a friend, an artist and thought partner, about his work with the Phillips Collection, actually, Emar Hutchins. And he talked about how he doesn't do work that explicitly and intentionally deals with white supremacy because he doesn't therefore give himself space to talk about Black excellence and the way that that's been marginalized and sidelines. Yes. And he said, when we completely consume ourselves with that work, it is devoid of liberatory energy. And I think that's a really important thing to think about and sit with as we come close to closing. What does it mean also to create space for liberatory energy? Because that's at least as equity producing as looking at the problematics.
And that gets us out of the binary of either or, that it actually is both. Love, Emar.
Wow, thank you. I feel like we really should have had a 3-day symposium. Had you two kick it off. So much richness in all that you shared. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules. We got the stars aligned. It was a real feat with planning this, and we had so many more questions. And just truly thank you both for coming here and sharing with us.
Absolute pleasure.
All right, now it's time for the homework. As you know, the Changemakers Review Committee sparked this initiative and worked with Artillery. We're funded by Human Resources. I want to thank Manuel for the funding. And as we close, we're going to look at a homework theme today that deals with urgency. Since George Floyd's murder, and we can truly say murder now that the case is over, although many of us were saying it before, there's been increased urgency, right? But there's been a critique of that urgency. I've heard some say, didn't you see that people were getting killed before? But I don't think we saw it in the same way. And some of us have had sort of ups and downs in our urgency levels around racial equity and the necessity of the work. What I'd like all of us to do this month is create a graph of your urgency over time, maybe over the last 5 years, but if you feel like you need to go back further and add something significant, do that. And note along the way which events sparked a shift in your urgency. Was it Trayvon Martin? Was it another event that really struck you? Or has your urgency been consistent over time? Create that graph, do some reflection, and then invite a friend to do the same. You may know someone who's in the audience, although I don't think you can see everyone, but it doesn't have to be a person who attended this event. I want you to see the slide that deals with the homework. And so, yes, create a graph that sort of tracks the changes in your level of urgency dealing with racial equity for the last 5 years. But if you want to go back further, you can do that. And again, invite a friend, have a discussion, engage each other, and talk about what that means for us. Again, next month's event is the politics of police reform after the George Floyd case. And, of course, Al, Stephanie, thank you. And again, Makeba, Calinda, thank you. And, Stephen, Erica, and others who helped with the logistics. Josephine, thank you so much. These events really do require a whole team. And
yes. Thank you, everyone. And I think we have to have Calinda and Makeba back. So we're going to have to find another day where these stars can align and bring them back for a longer conversation. I learned so much. So thank you.